Good day to you all, wherever you are. I think we've got people from the USA with us, and we've got people from Egypt, I think India as well, so we're across the world today. So I'll stick to good day because that's what we hope we've got everywhere. No, I'm not your speaker for tonight. I'm Alistair Scott, and I'm just the warm-up act. There's far better to come. As a past president of the Society and now chair of the events committee, I try to keep all our events and activities going, and I'm always on the lookout for interesting and forward-looking talks. Your turn may be next. This is the British Interplanetary Society's 20th live-streamed evening lecture since the start of the first lockdown in March of last year. And it's great to have so many of you here for tonight's fascinating talk. As most of you know, the British Interplanetary Society is the world's oldest, no, I should say it's actually the longest established organization devoted solely to supporting and promoting astronautics and the exploration of space. Formed in 1933, it has outlived all those that came before it. We continue to publish technical papers in our journal, JBIS, which began life in January 1934, and our technical committee runs a number of projects and studies ranging from propulsion systems and spaceports to interstellar spacecraft, spaceships, and colonies. Our motto is from imagination to reality. So if you have any bright ideas, please come to see us as quickly as you can. Our education and outreach team is always on the lookout for ways of promoting astronautics and space at schools and colleges, and has even drawn up a syllabus for a space A-level. They also are the UK coordinator for World Space Week. So if any of you have or are running any space events between the 1st and 15th of October, please let us know. The events team supports both the technical and education and outreach committees at their events, but also tries to find new events that it can attend and also bring along its ever-popular Soyuz ISS docking simulator, made by Fabrizio and the team in Italy, in Rome. So get in touch if you think you need us. Finally, if you've never visited the Vauxhall site, our Vauxhall site, please do so as soon as lockdown allows. Yes, we only have 5 days to go, but please bring a face mask, otherwise we'll be supplying one for you. At least you'll probably have to buy one from us. The building is a bit of a treasure trove for space history, with a comprehensive space library, an amazing collection of 1930s to 50s original artworks and archives that go right back to the start of the space age. I think some of you attended the Reinventing Space conference. It was great fun. I'm glad you got there. We enjoyed it. And the Arthurs that followed were the best attended ever. And even with social distancing, we had more finalists there than we've ever had. So it was a great evening. Today, we are again using Crowdcast for both the presentation and the Q&A. So most of you are already familiar with it. Please use the chat box for your networking and the questions box for your questions and answers. As you know, you can vote up and the questions you want go to the top. So get them in quick so that more people get the chance to vote. If you enjoy this evening and want to make a small donation, please click on the donate button at the bottom of the page. Every little helps to cover the cost of these lectures. I'm extremely pleased to say that Luc Joudrier, ESA's ExoMars rover operations manager, has agreed to talk to us tonight about the ExoMars rover from its earliest beginnings and give us a behind-the-scenes look at how he or she or it will be controlled when arriving on Mars in June 2023. I'll now hand over to my colleague in Rome, Fabrizio Bernardini, to do the introduction and later run the Q&A. Over to you, Fabrizio.
Thanks, Alistair. Can you hear me? It's fine?
Yep.
Thanks. And I'm not in Rome, I'm in Florence today because of work, so this is not my usual setting. And yes, we are very, very happy to have with us Luc Joudrier, and which comes to us with a long chain of friendships we had with Tiago Loureiro, with Todd Ferry, and all the people in ESOC. And we keep exploding this friendship to bring the behind the scene activities that we have in space programs that very seldom are discussed. So one of the aim of this series of conference we try to do in collaboration with ESA and also industry when possible is that to try and explain people exactly what people does for work when works in space. It's not only aerospace engineering, there is also other disciplines involved, and especially in an environment like ESA, it's very interesting how you start with one ability and then you grow up and you come, for example, to managing the operation of a rover on Mars, which is a little bit the story of Luke that he's going to tell us about. In fact, I'm not going to tell much about the biographical detail of Luke because he comes from control engineering, so what we call automatics in Italy, for example, and he has an extensive experience in ESA, but also he participated in all the decision points regarding the locomotion system of the rover. In the end, the rover is mostly about the locomotion system. And I am particularly interested in the way the telecommand system is managed, and that would be interesting for everybody. And there are cooperation with NASA about the relay activities. So, but these are all things that Luke will tell us. And his career and his experience, I think, are going to be important assets for this mission. But before we start this time, and I don't want to scare anybody because every time that I present something, people are scared how long it takes. I wanted to show a little bit, look at what is the BIS experience with rover, because we used the rover model to do a lot of outreach in many, many occasions. This project has been presented to huge events and about thousands of people or even 10,000 of people in different occasions, but also in small events, in smaller situations. So let me show you a little bit. And can you see my screen? I hope so. Luca, can you see my screen?
It's black. It was there and then it just disappeared.
Okay, I understood what I have to do. Okay, let's keep it this way.
Yes.
Now you see it, no?
Correct.
Okay, let's keep it. There is always this tricky thing. So we started a few years ago, we built, the BIS built this small rover with a chassis. We wanted something that was easy to replicate, but the major aim of this rover was to explain not really the movement, but, you know, everywhere you see people talking about driving a rover on Mars, you don't really drive the rover, especially on Mars. Maybe on the Moon sometimes they did it, but not on Mars. So this is a rover that works with the telecom and telemetries. So we use this rover model to explain how timelines are built, how they are transmitted, how the rover goes by itself on its own autonomy and stop and go into safe mode, also explain the mode of a spacecraft. So this has been a very simple but powerful concept that we use in many, many cases. This is a project that is one day or another is going to be published. We don't have enough time. And also this has been selected by ESRIN for some outreach activities. You see the collaboration with ESRIN about ExoMars. So we plan to use it again, but we have also other plans. We have a long-standing relationship with this, and we call it the force of outreach, and this is something. This is also the final version. You see now it looks more like a typical Martian rover. We also did something interesting about rovers, like in Maker Faire 2019, this lady, which is our lead mechanical engineer now, and she built this 1-to-1 scale of all the rovers. The Chinese one is not here. It was not, let's say, it's not published yet enough to do a model. But basically, we are comparing the size of all the rovers that have been on Mars, and they are going to Mars soon. And unfortunately, we only had visitors from NASA JPL during that event here and here. This is the lead GNC on MSL, and this is the lady, the operation manager on MSL. But I hope sooner or later you will join with the picture with this rover as soon as we can set it back on this stand. Of course, now everything is in a garage and taking dust as usual. Another after these things, and we started a new project, and the new project started with a wheel. So we built a wheel you may recognize a little bit. It started as a joke, as a 3D printed wheel, and it's flexible enough, and And we decided, starting from the wheel, to build all the rest of the rover. So we are building an ExoMars look-alike. It's not exactly the same because we wanted to concentrate on the possibility to replicate it rather easily. That's why, for example, we are using a simple commercial stepper motors, a 3D printed wheel, and also this element, mechanical element that comes from a company that does these standard elements. So these are easy to replicate. No, they're not even very expensive, so these are good. We are working on this right now. We are starting to build the first prototype of the locomotion system, and with some of the people you saw in the pictures before, and we are working on this project. And also we built, we sketched the avionics system that is going to be reasonably complicated. So we have a main computer, we have a CAN network inside. We are going to use RTEMS because for us, these educational activities are not only for the public, but also for the people who builds them. We have also a requirements document that's still in progress, of course, that defines a lot of the requirements, major requirements for this rover, because we use our educational activities to teach young engineers or young professionals, let's say, how we work in the space environment. So this is an outreach on both sides, for the public and also for the society members. Okay, I just wanted to show you. Also, we did just the first thesis, which was a deporting of RTEMS, the operating system, on Raspberry Pi, and which is the core. It's going to be the core of our operation. So just maybe for your curiosity, a little bit of what we are doing, and we always hope that in the future there could be some cooperation, because we like to do outreach, and just in case you need our help, we are ready to help any moment. Okay, so, and I leave the control to you. And as it has been explained, people can make questions using the button Ask a Question below. And the question can also be voted. So please check the question every so often. If you like some question, somebody maybe already posted your question, so vote it to give it more, to bring it to the top for a quicker answer. We will have the usual hard deadline now, 1 hour and 45 minutes from now. Now to you, Luke. Thanks again for participating.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for the introduction. I'm obviously very honored to have been given the opportunity to speak to you. So I will just share my screen and get started.
Let me remind everybody that there is the option, if you check back, well, there is the option to put your screen in full screen, and it will give you even a better way to see the presentation.
Fabrizio, do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So let's get started. So the title of my talk is about the exploration before the exploration. And obviously what I would like to express is what has been my experience through a couple of activities in ESA, building up toward the preparation of ExoMars mission. And I have the chance, I think I could say that, to have the opportunity of being at the control center when this will happen. So, of course, at the beginning, I'd like to really obviously acknowledge that all what I will present is on behalf of many of ESA and industry colleagues. Maybe some of them are part of the audience who have been working on it or are still contributing to this really ambitious project that is ExoMars. The focus of my talk is really on the rover, and I will discuss only a couple of key elements. I would need much more than 1 hour to go through an extensive presentation. And the purpose is really to illustrate the engineering aspect of it and highlight what ESA is doing there, and of course possibly industry, when they in their relation with ESA is doing as well as a request from ESA. So, but you will see that ESA is also doing quite a lot to prepare and run those activities. Of course, no need to say that surface exploration requires a successful landing, and I'm sure you heard the good news that a couple of days ago we have succeeded to deploy two parachutes for during the high altitude drop test that was in Kiruna, and there will be several of those still to fully qualify, but this is well underway and obviously very, very important event that I wanted to share also to you if you did not hear about it. I will not spend too much time on the rover mission goals. Of course, I believe you know this is a search of signs of life on Mars. But I will give you out of 2 slides the key elements for you to understand what is behind. Of course, a mission is also about engineering, preparation, etc. But there is an end goal, and it's a very important end goal, and you need to keep this always in mind. At the end, our customers are the scientists. So you probably know that early Mars is believed to have been very close to early Earth. This is 4 to 5 billion years ago. And that this means that the conditions for starting life may have been also supported on Mars. Obviously, Mars evolved differently, but the purpose of ExoMars mission is really to go very far back in time, between 3.9, 3.8 billion years ago, in a place where there are clays. So basically clays that we can identify from orbit. Clays are, let's say, formed underwater, so by sedimental depository, and where we want to go, which is, as you know, Oxyaplanum. We will speak about that a bit later. Oxyaplanum has these clays, and obviously we aim to go to the right place, in Oxyaplanum, and find and investigate the clays. One of the key elements of ExoMars is also the combination between the mobility and the subsurface access. This is really a key idea of the rover mission since right the beginning, and that's why probably you see that we are still using a very sketches of the rover to express this idea that out of many billion years, and you remember on the previous slide that we aim to go very back in time, 3 to 4 billion years. Of course, the radiations have been very large, and oxidants and ionizing radiations have, let's say, destructed most likely most of the organics. At least this is the thesis that started ExoMars. And the idea is really to go to Mars in those ancient places, find outcrops, and drill below 1.5 meter, where we believe that the possible remain organics will not have been attacked by those radiations. So this is really the fundamental ideas of the rover mission, and that makes it so unique. Now I will expand a little bit on the system configuration, but first I would like to present Rosalind Franklin, because this is how the rover ExoMars has been named. And of course, I mean, maybe you probably know, I mean, I will not go too long on, it has 6 wheels like all the rovers that have been on Mars so far. You can see the drill system in front, and it's always powered still by solar arrays. I mean, this class of rover cannot hold RTGs. We have small antennas. We'll speak later about that. And then a mast with a set of instruments. So we have 9 instruments in the rover. They are decomposed as survey instruments, like the PanCam instrument, which has wide-angle cameras and then a high-resolution camera, then an infrared spectrometer, ISEM. That's our really the high-level instrument. Then we have a CLUPI, which is mounted on the drill and has the interesting capability of either looking through mirrors in front of the rover or being able to image what the drill hole and the drill tip. And as well as when the sample is acquired and delivered to the sample delivery system, then it can take an image. From the back, you can see an important instrument, which is WISDOM, the ground penetrating radar. And this is basically our eye for searching for low, under the subsurface where to drill. So this is really a key instrument for us. The rest of the instruments, one of it is Hadron, and it's the same as the how's it called now? What is in Curiosity? It's a neutron detector instrument DAN. It's a Russian instrument. So we have the same instrument in the rover, and we'll be able to assess the amount of water molecules that are below in the subsurface. And then we have in the drill the MAMIS instrument, which is an infrared spectrometer that will be able to take measurement inside the drill hole. So basically, the head is in the drill system. So it's a very tiny and meticulous system, so called MAMIS. And then we have 3 instruments inside the analytic laboratory drawer that is basically the system that allows to crush the samples and distribute it into powders. 3 instruments: the Micromega spectrometer, the Raman laser spectrometer, and then what we call the MOMA instrument, which is composed of 2 instruments, actually, the LDMS and the GCMS, so laser disruption spectrometer, and then the GCMS, the gas spectrometer. So this is, in a nutshell and quickly, the attributes of Rosalind Franklin. And what I would like now is, behind the scene, this is the end product. And then I would like we spend a couple of slides into exploring what was in the beginning. The ExoMars rover actually started from an idea that is even before 2000. It's but the real work started in early 2000, and we had from an analysis from the ESA concurrent design facility. So this is regrouping at ESTEC the all specialists, and this is something that is completely standard nowadays. Basically, pre-studies are performed in the concurrent design facility. And that's one of the first output. And you can already see that is not that far from the end result, actually. maybe the mast is a bit simplistic, but we can see already 6 wheels, solar array, foldable antennas, and a drill in front. Then we have been obviously engaging industry to create activities, and this is the concepts that we had in phase A. It was already, as you can see, a lower class in terms of mass for the mass. We were not reaching yet 200 kilograms. I recall I did not say that Rosalind Franklin is about 300 kilograms now. What we can see is that the rover had a manipulator arm and an X-band antenna as well, steerable. Here you can see 2 concepts that were competing. One without RHU, and I had a very interesting orientable solar array and a lot of activities and antennas on the mast, while the other one was using RHU, radio isotope heating units, a few of them to be able to warm up. I mean, this is quite known that on Mars, surviving the temperature at night of below -100 degrees Celsius is a challenge for any system. And the radioisotope units, those small plutonium plasti, allows to save electrical energy by just radiating warm. So this was with fixed solar array. And then we moved into a concept in phase B, and you will recognize, maybe we will with a smile, that we were aiming to use the technique that was used by actually MER to land successfully. Well, MER was bouncing airbags. Here it was a different type of airbags, but that was airbags. And the concept of the rover was this one. It was more evolved, but still rather skinny, and still with the arm and the manipulator arm and the X-band steerable antenna. While industry has been pursuing with respect to the design, we entered the phase CD with a different, new different concept. The rover had grown much more into mass, and this is a very usual system issue of keeping the mass in control. And already we had understood that in this case the landing system with this mass was not adequate, and we had to change also the landing system. And then still we had already a rover design that looks quite close to the actual Rosalind Franklin system. So the science payload was already well defined. The nominal mission was already fixed to 218 sols, and we had already a target of 310 kilograms. We had, unfortunately or fortunately, lost the X-band and the robotic manipulator because of mass reasons. So the loss of the X-band antenna, of course, has some impact on the commanding, and this is compared to other missions like the NASA missions. Rover do have this X-band, and this is something that ExoMars and Rosalind Franklin doesn't have, and we need to cope with it. Then later on, we went into a more elaborated design, and this is when we had also a more tighter cooperation with Roscosmos, and who was in charge of designing the surface platform. So the landing system and the surface platform. But of course, at that stage, we didn't want to redesign the rover completely. And so one of the tasks was really to design a system around the rover. What is noticeable is that basically out of the design, you can see a bit of different solar array deployment system and the addition of ISEM infrared spectrometer. But that started to look already quite close to ExoMars, actually. And here we are. This is the reality. You can admire. I mean, these images have been published in the press, so you probably have seen them. Rosalind Franklin during the environment testing, and the Rosalind Franklin folded into the Kazachok landing system. So what I wanted to express with this let's say set of slides is that the rover had to cope with a number of changes. That is rather usual, of course, but still over the years, managing the environment was always quite a challenge. Now I would like to go a bit more deep into some mobility aspects. So this is how the rover is, but at the beginning we didn't know which terrain we should go and what we should specify to industry. So the very beginning we had even the intention to go from plus or minus 10 degrees to 45 latitude and plus 2 kilometers above Mola. That was revealed to be very challenging, and we soon went to minus 5 degree, so 5 degrees south to 25 north, and below 1 kilometer below Mola. Then, of course, still, I go back here. Still, this does not tell us what type of terrain we should specify for example, the navigation or the locomotion. So there was quite, and this is somehow the responsibility of ESA engineers to define those requirements, those environment requirements that industry needs to be able to take to produce a design. So this is really one of the first step of exploration that we had to do, and I must say that at the beginning of the project, not much was known from Mars. I mean, now we are receiving every day many images from Mars. It seems like normal, but at that time, 2003, end of 2003, I recall MER landed. MRO was not there yet with IRI, so we had not much. And we needed to create a terrain and a reference terrain to do the design. And that's very specific to the rover compared to an orbiter, where indeed you need to specify the environment, but usually it's still void. While here you need to specifically define it. And of course, you want to not be too difficult in order to not oversize your system, and not too easy because then later on you might not be able to drive on the terrain you have been you will be choosing later. So ultimately, we've been using a lot the work from Matt Kolombek and Rapp on this. So we had very interesting workshop with him, and that was very useful to understand his model of rock abundance. So in order to model the terrain and the rock amount, as well as we've been also studying statistically some areas of Mars to define a model of adirectional slopes, or that goes up to 21.5 degrees on a 5-meter scale and 12 degrees at 100-meter scale. So these numbers, they look like, yes, numbers, but there is a lot of thinking behind setting those numbers, because these are those numbers that really define your mission, and this is really the ESA responsibility to define those. And I included here a picture of a virtual terrain of the implementation that Airbus. Sorry, I still write ASU as the acronym for Airbus. So that's my bad, probably. So please read when it's written ASU. Please read Airbus UK. So basically, this is the reference terrain model that they have derived from those requirements, and from where all the locomotion and the navigation capabilities have been derived. So it's really important to keep in mind that we had to set this up very early with limited piece of information. That was interesting work. In the meantime, the landing site selection process has been initiated, and you see that they were due to some limitation, not so many options. I mean, it looks like so we had a very interesting workshop with the scientists to let's say to define what would be the best way to achieve the mission on the proper location, and Oxyaplanum was selected. Since most of actually all the proposed landing sites were above the equator, we had decided to simplify the mission to go from +5 north to +25. The reason was that the driving element was really the thermal environment, which is very, very difficult if we were there. So on up to or down to -5 degree latitude. And this is Oxyaplanum with the ellipse. It's a very big ellipse still because of ExoMars has a specific way of entering Mars that is not very yet precise. So 100-kilometer ellipse, and it means that we had still to study a lot all the terrain. So this is a very huge work performed by the scientists and also by the engineers to understand and certify that this terrain is good enough and safe for landing. Of course, and it was very interesting that at the end of the selection process in 2018, to be able to verify the statistics of this terrain against the initial terrain specification that we had, and this gave us the confidence that the terrain was good enough. But you can still see that we don't know still too much out of it, and one of the elements that I'm pushing my young trainee who is working with me at the moment is really to understand with the scientist what looks like the terrain of Oxyaplanum. What are and the purpose of this is really to prepare for the operations, because we still don't know too much. I mean, we have the high-res images. They are 25 centimeters per pixel. It's really great, but it's still no surface images. So we are trying to analyze if there are terrains that are similar on Oxyaplanum and on J0 crater, for example, or Gale crater. So other mission where we have surface imaging to understand if there are similarities to prepare ourselves. So it's a very continuous link with terrains. Continuing with terrains, once we had defined for industry the rocks and the slopes, we had really to also define the simulants, the soil, and agree with those, because these would be the soil that would be used for verifying and accepting the rover. So a lot of work has been done to understand and define soil simulant that would be equivalent physically to Mars. So that was also a very interesting work that, as you can see, is rather far from the usual courses of space engineering. That was very much related to terra mechanics, and that was also something that we enjoyed learning about. Similarly, we had the question of which chassis we would need, the rover chassis, and we could have gone with the Rocker Boogie system that was successfully used by NASA JPL mission. So at that time, Mars Pathfinder, and then later on MER, Curiosity and Perseverance. And but we had also contracted a company, a Russian company called RCL. Some of their engineers had been actually designing, and they were part of the Lunocode and Marsocode activities from Russia. And we had contracted them so that they proposed us, because we were rather new in this type of domain, they proposed us some type of different chassis to choose on. And this Type T was very, very performing. I hope you can see the small video. It's not very good quality, but the basic principle of this one was really using parallelograms to, like a suspension. The best suspension is when the wheels goes up and down. Wheels that move up, but moving also on front or back, are also a disturbance for the others. So that was the principle. But this one was rather, in fact, complicated, and in fact, it needed as well an averaging mechanism. And this is the same as the Rocker Boogie. It needs a system that link one side to the other. The Type E was, on the other hand, a bit more interesting or appealing in that case, because it had no averaging mechanism and was rather simple. The averaging mechanism is, in fact, done by the bogie that is going on behind. But unfortunately, we discovered that for this one, which has parallelograms, it has some limitation. And I wanted to share this for the audience. We discovered this actually limitation rather late, because very often we were doing simulations driving up. And in fact, driving up, the system had absolutely no problem. And then one day, some trainees been trying to drive down as well with their simulation, and discovered that this had some instability if the center of gravity was high enough at a certain slope. So that was not desirable. So all of this experience was fed into industry as well at the time, and the industry came up with, I think, a very neat solution of what we call the tri-bogie chassis. And Fabrizio was showing this just at the beginning. They are trying to replicate this system. It's very performant, very simple. locomotion formula 6 by 6 by 6 plus 6, the plus 6 being these articulated knees that allows the wheels to be folded and simplifies, of course, the storage of the system in the platform. Please note that we have maintained, and that was quite a fight, to maintain the 6-wheel steering, and you will see that this has great advantages. I hope I can convince you on this. And that was really a fight, because I recall, I said it before, but we are always tight with mass. Similarly, the question of which wheels was posed, and it needed to be as light as possible, fitting a tight volume inside the lander, but still having a good ground pressure. And we had only, as I recall, as understanding basically the wheels design of the GPL rovers at that time, to try to understand what was actually feasible to do on Mars. I mean, I recall this is almost more than 15 years ago. So, of course, the solution was to go, well, it was not of course, but it was go flexible. A lot of people were skeptical at the beginning, but it really proved to be a good choice, because of course, having flexibility increases the contact patch on the soil, on the terrain, and gives basically the equivalence of a bigger wheel. At the same time, it gives a very nice damping of an adaptation to the terrain, and you can see on the wheel below, on the video below, the wheel nicely adapting to the rock, so it gives a nicer ride to the rover compared to very rigid wheels. I'm sure that people who've been running rovers on rough terrain with rigid wheels have experienced this difficulty. Similarly, we had to ask which electronics, and this is a point that is really important, and even for the design, this is really a key technology that of the ExoMars rover. The cold electronics is really, I would say, a key element to that enabled the design of Rosalind Franklin. We had here the actuator drive electronic that we have chosen to put outside. The reason being that if you would put it inside, like the rover would have a warm box inside, the number of cables to go through outside to command all the motors would be extremely important, and would create a lot of thermal leakages, and it would be then basically defeating the idea of having something warm inside. So that was really a bet, but as well there are elements like the navigation cameras and localization cameras, the drill electronics, and all the external instrument, the PanCam, the ISM, Clupy, and MAMIS instrument that they do have to survive without additional energy during the night. So it's obviously a very big challenge in terms of design. In terms of for qualification of those mechanisms, we had to go for about 300 thermal cycles, so day and night, going down minus 130 degrees. So basically, it's even 10 degrees below the coldest on Mars to have a good qualification margin, and then up to the maximum temperature that the rover, the subsystem would see, and this 300 times. And this is really where you see that the technology and even the processes are at stake to be able to keep the system functioning in those harsh environment. So you even the glue that is used and the adhesives that are used commonly into the electronics are takes a big role when you have such thermal effects. So we had to learn also a lot of that and understanding and agreeing what would be the proper thermal cycle with industry. That was also quite a lot of learning on all sides. And this resulted into a number of locomotion capabilities. I have extracted some nice movies. So you see the point turn capability moving up a 25 centimeter step. So this mobility system is called the LVM for locomotion verification model that was built by Airbus UK to demonstrate the capabilities of the rover. And even with its small wheels, I must say it's very impressive capabilities. Thanks to the design of the chassis and the combination of with the flexible wheels, it's very very interesting. Really reassuring as an operator to know that your system is capable. Of course, we'll try not to go into those difficult terrains if we can, but it's very important for that. Similarly, we've been testing the system driving up slopes. So we had even facilities being developed to tilting facilities to test the system. And one of the elements that I see on this on the bottom right corner is the side slope, going side slope, and you can see, if I hope it's you can see that the 6-wheel steering are able to keep the rover on a very linear path, while it is very inclined. And a normal rover without the system, even only 4-wheel steering, would really slide down at the end of the box. We've been also doing the same with point turn on the slope, and the rover is really maintaining its position. It's really amazing, and it's really the credit of Airbus to have managed to keep this 6-wheel steering that enable this. Another main feature you probably have heard about for the rover is we've been exploiting the deployment actuators used for folding to increase our capabilities in extreme conditions, like we see here. So a coordinated movement of the driving and the deployment actuators to, like a worm, go up to the maximum basically that it could do, because it's really like climbing extreme. It's very reassuring. It's not a nominal functionality of the rover in terms of locomotion, but it's really, I'm sure you will understand, very reassuring. It's that if we would end up into some difficulties, we could use these wheel walking capabilities. With respect to deployment and egress, also this is something that when you see the Rosalind Franklin folded into the cadet shock, we also have developed, of course, the deployment that you will see here. So the video, although it's accelerated, is very slow. I will accelerate it so it's you can see it, but I wanted to explain that this is also, and mainly because the function is designed to be able to work in any condition of the rover. Here, it's the surface platform is horizontal, so it could probably go faster. But otherwise, since we can land up to 20 degrees maximum, that's one of the requirements derived from the terrain that we've been discussing previously. And you can see the situation, in extreme situation on the right. Then basically the rover is deploying its system, and it needs to keep the surface the rover body horizontal with respect to parallel with respect to the surface platform. So this is or fairly parallel to the surface platform. So this is done by slowly moving the actuators and with a combination of rotation of the front and the rear wheels to raise the system. The middle wheels remain attached actually, and the HDRMs, so the attachments are only released at the end of the sequence. So this is what we will aim to do when we have landed. I will explain this a bit later. And then with respect to the actual egress, once we have deployed, we will go through the egressing. So I let you see. This is quite an extreme case, as you can see. It's we've been unlucky to have a good 25 centimeter rock creating a step at the end, and as you can see, the surface platform is inclined, I think, to up to 20 degrees. So it's really one of the extreme case. And then we let the rover go. So many tests have been performed into this, and it required a lot of dedication from the industry to achieve all those tests. So we've seen the locomotion capabilities, which are really linked to the rover chassis and mobility. And I like then to move up in terms of system with introducing the GNC, and there are a couple of basic functionalities to move. The direct driving, which is basically moving the rover in Ackermann mode, open loop. Then the locomotion and localization only, so which means that we can set a distance, but it's still driving open loop, but we can still set a distance. It counts not only the turns of the wheels, but using the localization system that I will present later. And then, of course, we have one of the key system functionality of the GNC, which is a follow path, which is basically executing a trajectory within a corridor in a closed loop, and the trajectory is defined by the ground, and that's let's say the ground to assess whether it's safe or not. So this is basically what has been rehearsed, and that was performed very recently successfully on the Mars Terrain Simulator at ROC with the ground test model, which is the replica of the Rosalind Franklin. You probably have seen this movie in the press. And then, so this is for the basic functionalities. And then, of course, we have the higher level functionalities, which is using the onboard cameras to assess the terrain and define its onboard itself, its safety, define the safe terrain in front. So we have an intermediate solution before doing a full autonomous navigation, where the rover is only deciding by itself to set to the goal, the path to the goal. We can also use upload a trajectory from ground, and then ask the rover to check if it is actually properly running. So I have a small movie that we had made as a prototype also in ESTEC, in the robotics laboratory. So this is one of the elements that we do also at ESTEC, is we need to be able to be proper customers toward our industry. We need to understand what they are doing and look ahead as well. So we do develop also prototypes to understand and what are the problems that might occur and what could be the solution. And this is also an opportunity for trainees to develop new algorithms and etc. that we then later on create as either research and development proposals or even helpful for directly to a project. I don't have a movie of Airbus, but autonomous navigation, but I can this image of the MDM and in Airbus Marsyard in Stevenage to, of course, highlight that the work of industry of development of this autonomous navigation is done there. So you see that there is a pendant between the ESA work and the industrial work, and I think we've been working quite well together to reach this. A bit of GNC work. So this is, of course, a credit to Airbus UK. Of course, at the very beginning, we've been agreeing this type of solution that nowadays are rather common, but 15 years ago, that was not common in the space, aerospace engineering knowledge. So since then, we have lost the sun sensing because it was a very difficult, actually, solution. We used, we had several failed ITTs, industry not proposing a suitable solution, and we had decided to go without, or at least at the end, not having a specific sun sensor, but be able to do sun sensing with our camera instead. So the GNC architecture is rather classical, where we have a block of localization. It is used with the IMU designed by TAS UK, and the localization camera that are fixed on the body in front. And these provide the capabilities to do sensing of the gravity and integrate also with using the visual localization let's say fusion to be able to have a best estimate of the real-time position of and attitude of the rover. So this visual localization started with the concept of Oxford University, and that has been brought into ExoMars, and it is very, very well performing. We reach, I think, below 1% of accuracy. So it means that after 100 meters, we are below 1 meter. And the characteristic is, thanks to the coprocessor that the rover has, it has basically a dedicated coprocessor to run this. So it's running as long as the rover moves, it runs and take pictures every 10 seconds. And the principle is basically the comparison between one picture and the other, comparing the features and finding a model that transform the features one to the other. Then, of course, we have the planning capabilities used using the NavCam images that were built by Neptec Canada. The onboard planning, so basically, as I explained just before, so it's a solution from Airbus UK and CNES. and then the trajectory control that we saw some movie about. So it's a fairly standard system, so to say, but it's good when it works robustly. So we're happy, we're very happy with it. And of course, there is a system next to it with respect to monitoring. And I would like to highlight, because I've been really highlighting this importance of the slip edge monitoring for the operations. I mean, once we will be running on terrains, we will analyze the terrain, and we intend, because it's not done, but in the future, we really intend to characterize the type of terrains and how they are, how slippery they are, so that we can feed in the planning. So this is where we start to go for operation. I think, have to go a bit faster because I see I'm running late, and I want to give you opportunities to provide questions. So the one key element for the operations is defining a reference surface mission. That was really a big work that was made between engineers and the project scientist, Jorge Vago, at the time. So as soon as we had defined this reference surface mission, I think a lot of engineers stopped asking a lot of questions about how we want to use this, etc. I mean, because of course the users we were representing the users as ESA, so it was very, very helpful to define what is intended to do. At the end, it's as simple as this, but it's not always easy to define very, very early, especially because we did not have yet a full agreed set of instruments defined, so they were still selection. So it was a moving target. So as a summary, I don't have anything graphic. I will just very simply tell you we aim to do experiment cycle that consists of driving to a site using the mobility, survey the site to understand the geological context using all the survey instruments. I forgot Clupy actually here. And then based on this survey, define where to do a subsurface survey using the Wisdom ground penetrating radar that I introduced before. And then these are the eyes to understand what is below and define where we want to acquire the sample using the drill and doing some MAMIS measurements inside the borehole. Then once we have acquired the sample, we ingest it, crush it into powder, and then analyze with the Micromega, Raman, and MoMA instruments. That's one experiment cycle. And there is one other aspect we want to do is vertical survey. So vertical survey is basically staying on the promising site, and instead of drilling 1.5 meter or maybe 2 meters, really drilling every 50 centimeters and analyzing the sample each time, so that we have a comparison of the content in let's say in depth. So several points, and of course this will take a lot of time. So we are not aiming to do it too often. We will do it when the scientists believe this is worth it. So in theory, we are aiming to do 5 experiment cycles within the mission and 2 vertical surveys. But the vertical surveys are really a strategic decision based on what we understand. So, but initially, this is what the industry has been using to design the operations. I recall The mission duration, it's maybe you will see there is a discrepancy, but it's not. It evolved. So we have lost recently 7 days before the theoretical dust storm season. We hopefully this will not happen, and we will be able to have an extended mission. But the nominal mission is now 211 sols, so about 7 months. And with this, we have 10 sols for egressing, 20 sols for commissioning about, and then because of the move, we will have also to face more than 20 sols of solar conjunction. So where the rover is not cannot be communicated with because of the solar conjunction. Very quickly, something that I would like also to reflect to you. So you see an image of the planning tool of the rock. So a list of plan. I will go a bit deeper into this later. But there are a number of aspects that we don't control in the rover. We cannot, as a ground operator, we cannot control. So of course the rover wake up that depends on the minimum power generation. It's predictable to some extent, but it can vary. The morning communication, I will come to that later. The warm-up duration, they really depend on the environment. They are also predictable, but to some extent only. The power generation as well. The duration for the autonomous navigation, of course. The drilling duration is, let's say, dependent on how hard is the subsurface, and we will have an understanding thanks to the ground penetrating radar of Wisdom. Then the sample crushing duration as well is something that we have not control of completely. The instrument duration as well, some of them are temperature dependent, so this will also be quite a challenge to feed in the planning tool. And then, of course, the time for communication in the evening and for when the rover goes to sleep. So these two introduce the next step, which is that basically the rover by nature cannot be well predicted in terms of behavior. And what is really important is to be able to have a rover that is event-driven, meaning that you start an activity and like warm up, and it will last a certain amount of time. And then when this activity is finished, completed, then you move to the next without adding an estimation of with margins of how much maximum warm-up would be, etc. Because at the end of the day, you would build up an impossible plan. So that's what is really important. And at the very beginning, we had a lot of discussions about which level of autonomy this ExoMars rover had to have. Luckily, we had a lot of activities in ESA performed. We had the functional reference model in terms of rover architecture that was supporting also autonomy. We had also several R&D activities, such as an activity called Muroko that really introduced the concept of activity plans interpreted on board and driven by events. And I must say that actually Muroko was aiming to have on top a formal verification of such a plan based on tasks and actions, and that's something that nowadays is more common, having formal verification. At that time, that was rather new. The ExoMars rover at the end did not need the formal verification that was done, but the concept of activity plans based on task and action remained. And actually, this really triggered a lot of functional analysis, especially on the TASI side. So here you see an image of the representation of a typical 3-layer architecture with a planning, executive, and behavioral layer. And then you see the actions that are more or less like single bricks, where you have always precondition and exception and exceptions and then post conditions. So they are very well behaved. And then based on those actions, you build up tasks and you build up then activity plans. It's, I think, very much more common to build this up nowadays. Even some Lego system do apply those type of algorithmic, but 10 to 15 to 20 years ago, that was at the forefront of the robotics knowledge, and it was definitely a change of paradigm for the space engineering systems. Ultimately, we have built up a mission management software that is able to do an activity plan validation, capability to replan if it has been provided some alternative. So typically, we would be using this if we have defined half a panorama, and then we do a validation, and do we have still energy and time for this? And yes, if it is the case, then we can add the other half of the panorama, for example, to give an example. It runs as well the task execution and do configuration checks. Then, and that was really what was difficult, is to merge this concept with the classical execution of spacecraft, where we have that are usually compliant to the packet utilization standard, so the TMTC that most of our European ESA spacecraft do understand. But these are not necessarily interpreted on board, and actually, but usually on a timeline. Here, the Rosalind Franklin with barely use the mission timeline. It will be mainly run from the mission management. And then we have a functional layer, of course, to run the activities. I see on the left, you can see an example of activity plan. So this is interpreted on board. And what is very nice is that it's human almost readable. So it is very, very helpful to build up activities. And one of the elements and the key driver for it is really that we really needed to have short time. We were anticipating that we would have short time to react and build up a new activity plans on the day. So when we receive the telemetry, we need to tell what next, and of course we needed to have very simplified high-level commands to be able to agree with all of this. In addition to this system, we have defined a hierarchical FDIR, so fault detection, isolation, and recovery. So every layer will take care of its own fault. And actually, one of the key elements was, when we were discussing autonomy, is the rover needing to reconfigure itself if it has a fault, or etc., etc. So that was a lot of things, and we've been really defining the scope of the autonomy, that if there are really faults or anomalies, faults and failure, then the rover will wait. And there are only at the end only a few anomalies that basically where the rover will say, okay, locomotion is not available, and it's not a major problem that requires attention of the ground, and we can keep on running the mission with alternative plans. Of course, when we speak about autonomy, we speak about autonomous navigation, and I spoke about it already. And then something that is also quite special is the cooperative science that we have implemented on board, and it's really specific to the ALD instruments, Micromega, Raman, and LDMS, where basically Micromega is able to analyze a sample and define on the powder where are the region of interest that are worth and are most interesting for the subsequent instruments. So this is implemented on board, and this will save us a lot of time in pre-analyzing the sample as soon as it has been ingested into the rover. So at the end, the rock is an activity plan factory. So it still use the SCOS 2000 developed by ESOC and is used for controlling the other spacecraft, but it is also using virtual environments where you can develop the activity plans within a context. And this is really something that is very important for planetary mission. So this one, ROC tool or rover validation, rover visualization and planning is derived from an ESA R&D activity called 3D Rocks. So that was also something that I wanted to say, is that not only the R&D activities that we are doing in advance of those missions help to build up the knowledge of ESA, but it also helps to build up the knowledge of industry so that they are in a proper position to give the good solutions when we need on the project. So this was a very successful activity. And similarly, the ROC is using the rover simulator for ExoMars, ROSEX, that is used to do some system engineering validation. But it as well, in the ROC, is the ultimate system that is checking the logic of the plan and the resources. So this was also derived from an R&D activity called 3D Rov that I had the pleasure to follow at the beginning of ExoMars. We move to the ROC. The mission architecture is the following. I will go very quick from the right to the left. So we have the Marsat sets, Rosalind Franklin, Kazachok for the ExoMars mission. And then, of course, we have also ongoing NASA system on the surface. And why I'm highlighting them is because we are sharing resources, which are the orbiters to download the images. And you should know that TGO is one of the main assets that is at the moment retrieving pieces, the beautiful images and videos of Perseverance and Curiosity. So this is a very important asset for the community, so to say. So these are the orbiters, and they are the data relay. And then we have the ground stations, and here we have Russian ground station, ESA STRAC system, and the NASA DSN that are coordinated actually by the two systems, the MAROS system and the ERCO, the ESA Relay Coordination Office. And these are the two entities that are coordinating the overall communication system for all the assets. So there is a very strong and powerful cooperation in this sense. And of course, once the telemetry, the data arrives, then they go either to the ROC or to the SPOC, so the Surface Platform Operation Control Center, which is in Moscow, or to the ROC in Turin. And then once these activity, let's say, have been performed, we create the data archive for the long-term legacy archiving, and these go to the ESAC, to the Planetary Data Archive on the ESA side, and to the EKI in Moscow for mirroring the mission. So this is the equivalent of the PDS for NASA, that I'm sure you are aware, you know well of. I don't know if if you are familiar with the ROC system. So we have built the main control room in Turin, in Altec, with the science operation room for the scientists and the planning room for the operators. And this will be the hot rooms during the operations. And then we have engineering room and the Mars terrain simulator, where we run the ground test model, and you can see attached. And probably you have remarked that it has a strange system that we call the RUD, rover unloading device, and it's not a rapid unscheduled destruction, which is also another acronym if you search for it, another definition of acronym, but it's a rover unloading device. And that basically offload the rover to the Martian gravity, because since the system is so tight, there were no possibility to have at system design a rover that would sustain the Earth's gravity. So in order to reduce the size of the actuators, still having the necessary margins, but of course factor 3 is really important. So we have taken this, and the drawback, of course, is that the replica on ground needs to be weight compensated. And then we have the Science Operation Control Center, which is in a quite at the first level of the Operation Control Center, so in a quiet area where the scientists will be able calmly to assess their data. A quick tour on the organization. What is very special with respect to this mission is that there is a very day-to-day work and a need of a strong coordination between the science team and the control team. And this is what is foreseen for the routine operation, where the ROC team is basically the science team plus the control team. This is led by the project scientists and the science team leads. And on the other side, the operators are led by the rover operation manager. I mean, I would say probably managers, because we will go on shifts, and we need to sustain quite a long term to work 7 days a week. So there will be many of these of people in this role. And then we have operators, and traditionally we have also the project team and the rover sustaining engineering team, which is basically the engineering team who has built the spacecraft, who will be helping us on site when it will be the time of the egress and the commissioning, and then remotely when we have entered routine operations. On the left, of course, the science team that was taken during an ExoMars science working team. It's not all the people. There are many more scientists. It's hundreds, but it gives you an idea. And then on the right, some Altec operators in the main control room at work. Commanding cycle, I will try to go very quick because I am in the time, and probably you are familiar with this. It's obvious that somehow we have secured with the orbiters to send in the morning the activity plans and retrieve in the afternoon and evening the commands and for data assessment. So this is, let's say, fairly easy. What is not, or that gives a bit of a challenge is, of course, and it's well known that Earth time and Mars time are changing. So 40 minutes a day difference, and that basically after 10 days you are almost out of sync. In addition, you have variable visibility, even if you use the network around the world, and a variable visibility also for the orbiters. that de facto change also the variable data volume. Yeah, what I want to I need to highlight is that the TGO is not sun-synchronous, so it is scanning the Mars. So that's ultimately what is important, and then de facto we have this variability that comes into play when we need to schedule communications. And de facto, what is at the end useful for operation is we have basically 4 to 8 hours only for tactical operations, meaning when we have the time between data assessment and activity plan sending, which is not much. I recall very well GPL colleagues highlighting that for curiosity, at that time they were planning 16 hours of work. They had the luxury of having direct to earth commanding, so that basically these latencies were not there, but we have to plan for that. And of course, it may also constrain the rover activities. Luckily, all of these can be planned well in advance and comes into a constraint for the planning of the operations. Going very quickly on the phase activities, what I want just to say is that for cruise, egress, and commissioning, basically all the activity plans are already predefined, and we are testing them heavily at the moment. While, of course, when we enter gradually to routine operations, then the activity plans and the activities will be on the daily defined by the Science Operation Working Group. And I just wanted also to highlight that with respect to the training, we will have a peak of training during the cruise phase so that we are well prepared at the arrival. I will go very quickly on this. The PLT strategy, so the egress and post-landing to egress strategy. The first to solve, we will land and the rover will deploy once the surface platform has landed and has deployed, then the rover will switch on and will deploy its right solar array. The left is not possible because the antenna of the surface platform is there. So we have this deployment and we'll take some pictures. So hopefully soon after we will receive some early good confirmation of deployment. And then afterwards, we hopefully on the Sol 2 will have a very small activity plans, only using PanCam images, because we want to test the survivability of the rover. So we don't want to start to do too many things, and we will go gradually. Then there are a number of sols that are dedicated to deploying the mast, taking images, of course, and then all the steps for the deployment of the mobility system. You saw the video. And then at the end, we release the umbilical. We check that it is well released and by driving, and then we drive off the 5 meters or the ramps. If I summarize, when we land, I hope we can see, we take some pictures of the lander as well, so we have situational awareness. We do the early commissioning. We do a strategic planning on ground to be able to understand where to egress, which direction. We have 2 options. Where to do the vicinity activities for commissioning. Ideally, if we are able to do, we would go all around and be able to have a mutual imaging of the rover and the surface platform. Then we will define where to open the ALD. So this is what we call the Science 0 now. And then the first site. So this is really what we aim to ideally define before we start egressing. Then this will define basically very early on the activities. They will be, of course, revised along the way. And then once we have egress, we do the near party platform activities. We go to the LD opening. We drop the drill witness sample, which is closing the drill tip for planetary protection reasons, and then we analyze the blanks. so that we verify that the ALD is still very well clean. And then we drive to a Subiel site where we will be doing some drilling and commissioning the drill. What is important with respect to rock processes is really, and this is in order really to cope with the tight schedule, only I recall 4 to 8 hours of tactical planning, is basically to move everything we can into the strategic process that runs in parallel at normal working hours. So there will be a strong strategic planning that will give the indication, the scientific guideline, and even the activity plans that are intended based on the knowledge we know at that time, to the tactical planning as well as an organization of the shift. So once the rover telemetry arrived, then the full tactical process runs with specific, really well-codified steps of leading to first assessment of the rover status meeting, and then a planning activity that will be completed by SOWG meeting, Science Operation Working Group meeting. And this is basically a scientist finally agreeing with the plan. And then down the road, a validation and a tag up so that we are sure that this is good enough, and then it can be sent to the rover. So in a nutshell, this is what are the processes at stake for the rover. I will really pass quickly because I want to give you the chance of answering questions. So field testing, I prepared this to recall that we've been quite active in the past in doing what we could already very early on. Maybe some people will recall, and you see Bridget rover doing on the Mars yard of CNES some localization tests in 2008. And then some testing that we've continued with other rovers of CNES in that time frame. Then we went to Aziza R&D activity to Atacama Desert, trying to do some long driving capabilities. And in the same time, we were also doing remote control with CNES rover with PanCam and Wisdom and Clupy all mounted together. And that paved the way for the safer remote control from Harwell test. It was again in Atacama using Bridget rover. That was a very successful and intense field test. And you see that all these tests that had before were the precursor to be able for ESA R&D to set up properly with industry these tests. So learning is really important. We've been afterwards doing a lot of egress testing, trying to understand what is the strategy to egress if we have, and what is the decision making to go to the front or to the back. That's not that, although it's basically two choices, it's not that easy. And then we've been doing a number of other tests that came to the ExoFit testing that you probably heard about. Also, again, in the Atacama with a much more close to ExoMars model. I think it's called Charlie. And then at the moment, this is really where we do validation is with the ground testing model at Altec in the Rock Mars Terrain Simulator. So this is it. And to be complete, of course, I don't forget that in Airbus Stevenage, they have a very interesting Mars yard where they have been doing locomotion testing with the MDM rover extensively, and the picture would have been incomplete if I would have missed this one. I'm not pretending that all the tests, field tests that happened are in this bar chart, but the main ones, I would say. to complete, we are undergoing training and simulation, and this is already starting. To give you an idea, the first simulation performed remotely with the scientists has happened. We had chosen a landing site that basically a number of the community just discovered. We used and we reused the ExoFit context images for that purpose, and that was a very a good move to have also this platform carried to the Atacama Desert, because then that was the ideal situation for the test. So and then we've been using the tools of the rock with the operators to plan imaging, and then ultimately to plan a strategic activities, as I explained. So in conclusion, I hope I gave you a bit of a view of 20 years almost of engineering journey for not only ESA, but for industry and the scientists. I've been highlighting a number of R&D activities that were done prior to the project that really managed to go and serve well the project and make it strong. There is at the moment the ongoing evaluation at the ROC with the GTM. So please stay tuned. In a couple of weeks, you should have a nice public relation in the press, so that it will be nice. And of course, all of this knowledge is not only build up for the execution of the mission, but it's the basis for the future mission. And for example, we know that the sample fetching rover part of the Mars sample return campaign is ongoing in terms of development. So my concluding word is based on that, I'm looking, of course, forward to start the scientific exploration. And then I welcome questions. My apologies, they have been longer.
Yeah. Thanks, Luca. That was a great presentation. It was extremely interesting. Pity that a lot of interesting things went in the end, and you had to go fast. And yes, we have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, we are also very short in time. So I will try to ask you a few questions, the one we can, and also maybe I can post via email also some other questions to you, and we will maybe answer them.
With pleasure.
So please try to be very short, something
I try.
30 seconds for each one. We will probably do a few of them.
You are challenging me.
I think you already answered this, but there is a question from Rodney. How many Mars analog sites were considered for simulating rover operation? I think this has been answered by.
Yeah, we went to Atacama that were, let's say, analog. It's very difficult to find analogs for Oxyaplanum because basically terrains of 4 billion years do not exist on Mars. So we've been also testing activities recently in ExoFit, also in the south of Spain, and in Tenerife, Airbus has been going. So there are many sites in Europe as well. In Morocco, I heard as well there were some testing. So yeah, a couple, but it's very difficult to find analogs, at least scientifically. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And there's a question for myself. It was in one of your papers, you said that the MRO was not going to be probably available, but actually it is going to be available if everything goes well.
It's
for many more.
It's great, and of course when we do engineering in those missions, we need to do the best case and the worst case, and then have a mission that works with the worst case as well. And luckily, it seems to be the planet seems to be aligned.
Good. So you count on them models from them or something like that, extended imagery and things like that, I imagine, no?
Yes, we have agreements with NASA, and we intend to receive. I mean, we are expecting to receive once landed MRO image like they have done in the past.
Okay. So I have a question from Paolo. I'm a big fan of wheel walking. Do you think it will make a difference on Mars? And what about using deployment drivers to distribute pressure and grip on land?
Yes. So on Mars, okay, it will escape. It will allow us to escape to situation that that we know. The American rover got stuck several weeks. I recall I think it was Purgatory Dune for Opportunity. So we would not have such a problem with the active suspension. It's not designed in terms of actuator to be very fast, but personally, I think that a rover model, a rover that has walking capabilities that are fast, basically you are moving without slippage. So at a certain stage of level of slippage or difficulty in the terrain, basically you might be more efficient using wheel walking. And actually you can also drive while you do wheel walking. So it's like ski hiking. So there are many nice ways to implement it.
That's going to be very interesting and also difficult to plan, probably. Okay, and I have a question from Simone. Simone and Paolo, they are both working on our rover project. I have seen a publication, different version of ExoMars wheels mounted on different prototypes. How complex was the development process of the current deformable wheel, and in how many types of terrain was it tested?
Oh, very specific question. It was a rather complex. The concept comes from if I recall well, the DLR and colleagues from Lutz Richter. But then the implementation was later on performed by industry. There has been some long-term testing. I think it's several kilometers on a trail to be able to verify that it's able to sustain the several times the mission lifetime. So it's a bit difficult to answer precisely to your question. Maybe send me an email. I will try to give you more detail.
Okay. A question from myself for our design. It's the gimbal, which is for it that attach each bogie to the structure. Is it a free to move, or there is a spring that dampen the movement of the gimbal?
It's fully free to move, and that's to enable naturally the let's say the equalization of the load for each wheels. Ideally, the perfect rover chassis is the one that equalizes the loads on the 6 wheels.
Okay, good. That's very good for our design too. Yes. Okay. Also, did I understand well that you did the thermal cycling that is in close to vacuum condition for the entire duration of the nominal mission?
Well, of course, we did not do it's accelerated. Maybe I should have highlighted good too. I should have put accelerated as well. Of course, we don't spend so there are gradients of temperature. So we went 300 times to minus 130 to sometime. I mean, if it's electronic, it can go up to 80 degrees, and then accelerated. So respecting a gradient that is correct as well, because of course if the gradient is too high, then it becomes irrealistic, and then you would be breaking the system instead of qualifying it to the extent.
But you still did more than 200 cycles.
Yes.
Oh wow.
Yes.
Very long time.
It takes several weeks to do this activity with special facilities, a special process. I think industry has been learning a lot also together with us on this topic.
I think it will be very important to write a book about the engineering that went into the ExoMars rover. This is a fantastic experience for everybody. Pity we don't write these kind of books. Okay, we will see. And a question from Simone: could you explain the Ackermann commands?
So the Ackermann command, maybe I should have put in fact, Ackermann is basically defining a center of instantaneous center of rotation, and basically aligning all the wheels toward this instantaneous or fixed center of rotation, and adapting the speed of the wheels to the distance they have to travel, so that basically, of course, if you want the rover body to move and drive on an arc of circle, then the external wheels have to drive a longer distance, so they need to drive faster actually to be in sync. So that's basically what Ackermann means. And here we have this is Ackermann you have on your car with two wheel steering, but this is double Ackermann. Usually even okay. What Airbus has defined as what is called generic Ackermann, because we have 6 wheel steering.
Okay.
So all the wheels are orientated toward the central to the center of rotation.
Okay. And a question from Dean. I would like to know, what is the projected life expectancy of the rover?
It has been qualified for 218 souls, so I have zero doubt that it will do that. And it will very much, in my opinion, depend on whether we will have a global dust storm or not. This is the major threat, because we will not intently go into a dangerous situation. So the only hope I have is that it is as successful as the predecessors rover on Mars.
Yeah, we hope so. Same. And do you think that the Mars Express mission will be extended to support ExoMars operations on the surface?
I believe so. I heard about some talk about that, yes.
Okay.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think at least ESA is in talk about that.
Good. That will be very important. What improvements would you make on the next rover, from Alex?
Interesting. The difficulty of is that the rover is a system by itself, and each mission has its characteristics. So it's difficult to compare one mission to the other. If you would be redoing ExoMars, exactly what would be different? It's a good question. If we are allowed of more mass, of course, because this always has a cost. What I really learned out through this journey is I was a young engineer, and my studies are not space engineering, actually. I learned it, and maybe youngsters do learn this at school, but something that is not necessary doesn't fly. So there are so many loops of discussions on is this, can we do without, etc., because we need to save power, mass, etc., that it's very difficult to make the same mission different, probably. So, but being able to go, let's say, a bit faster would be of interest. The technology with respect to the cameras, I mean, we have developed those cameras around with 2 years for the navigation localization. Maybe new technologies are available, and those type of improvement. I think in the long term, and we see this with the Ingenuity helicopter that is using some commercial off-the-shelf qualified for the missions. I mean, this is really, in my opinion, a good path toward integration of electronics, and you see that the rover is very big also because it has a lot of electronics. So there is technologies improvement there to enable new types of missions, so to say.
Okay, I think we have just a few minutes left for closing the event. I have more questions, but I copied all of them. I will send them to you via email, and we will try to make these available. I don't know exactly how, but I think Elizabeth knows that. And let me see. I can put back my camera maybe. And Alistair, do you want to?
Well, I think you can carry on with a few more questions, and I'll just say good night in a minute. Give me 1 minute at the end.
Okay, and how much time do we have left?
You have 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes.
Oh, good. So it's going to be cut it short. Let's try another question. It's a long one. Maybe you can read it. With reference to one of the PLT commissioning image on the landing site, given the color does not look like the rust red of Mars. Was that image from the HiRISE instruments aboard the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter? I think it was the blue one.
Actually, we've been post-processing it with an interesting tool that we are experimenting using AI techniques, CNNs, convoluted neural networks. It's part of an R&D activity called NOAA that is run by SciSys UK and now CGI, and that is enabling the assessment of the terrain from features. So we've been training those algorithms to do the job on our behalf, and that's why they were different colors. That help the analysis of the terrain. That's what.
Okay. All this software would be very interesting to understand one day and have a talk about these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also buzzing a few keywords so that people interested can search on the internet. There are some publications about that.
Yeah. Maybe for a follow-on talk, if you feel like doing that, that would be great. And what is the best, a question from Elian, what is the best approach when you don't have detailed images of the terrain? So, for example, if you do want to design a rover for Venus, for example. A lot of autonomy, I imagine.
Yes, I think you prepare for the best. No, you hope for the best, but you prepare for the worst. So, yeah, it would be very difficult to define a limit of design. We have one or two, I think at least one image of the surface of Venus, if I recall well. So I would start from that.
Good. Very quickly, navigation front. Is there any scope for onboard machine learning at the edge from Rodney?
The coprocessor and the processor we have are Leon 2, so probably with higher performances, FPGAs dedicated, there would be addition. But for the ExoMars itself, I doubt that it would be efficient. What is would be interesting is to have already those post-processing using on ground. So you receive the telemetry and then you do to help the scientists to process faster. Okay.
I give control back to Alistair for the final greetings then. And Lucas, thanks a lot for these fantastic talks. There are a lot of measures in the chat. You can read it, and the talk will be available if you want to share with others. It will stay here on the website. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, Luke. That was great, and I'm sorry we didn't give you more time, but and thank also Fabrizio for the introductions and for fielding the questions. And a big thank you to Elizabeth for once again coordinating the evening behind the scenes. If you enjoyed tonight's talk and want to make a donation, please remember to click on the donate button at the bottom. Every little helps to cover our costs. I was going to raise a couple more events coming, but book yourselves in for the 27th of this month when we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 15 mission. I think it's time to go now. So goodbye to all, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next evening event. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.